Good afternoon to you all. Welcome to this digital event. In the following session, we have the pleasure of having speakers who will be a source of great inspiration. They've worked on projects for 3 years, research projects. But before we start, I would like to briefly introduce myself. I'm Suyin Arts. I work from Belgium, and I'm active in the media sector in Belgium. I work for television channels, but sometimes I can also travel to be a moderator of panels, to have interviews with people, and to present events. Now, of course, the events that are like a television emission are something that's quite usual today. And I must say that I'm very happy to have been invited to be the moderator of this final conference because the topic of inequality is really of great importance to me. In order to understand inequalities and the revolution, it is crucial to understand their determinants. The 3 studies presented in this session focus on the territorial nature of inequalities, their reaction to shocks and policies, as well as to the structural causes of the revolution. Building on the cases of Cameroon, Ivory Coast, and Tunisia, the 3 projects that we're going to discuss today provide an overview of both macro and micro level drivers of income distribution. And I would also like to mention that you can raise questions using Slido, and you can do that during the whole event. Do not hesitate to mention to whom you want to address your question. But before we listen to our speakers who are going to present those projects, I would like to introduce Mr. Denis Cogneau, who's going to set the scene for this session. Mr. Cogneau is professor at the Paris School of Economics. He's a research director. And his work in the past has focused on the income distribution related to the policies adopted in sub-Saharan Africa. And his research today is about the policies of colonialism and of economic development of Africa, and this in the long term. So you can see that he's really the ideal person to tell us about the scene, about setting the scene of this conference. Thank you. Can you hear me? Perfect. So first of all, I'd like to thank the Agence Française du Développement and also the participants to this session. Thank you for bearing with me. And as I've been asked to introduce this session on the inequality drivers, I considered it would be useful to focus on one of those to better understand the situation in developing countries. We have a long history there. I think that dualism is important. And I will also refer to another point that is very important if we want to fight against inequalities, i.e. tax policies, and I will try to explain the interactions between dualism and the development of tax capabilities. And on the basis of personal recent work on these 2 topics, I will try to give you some examples that refer to Tunisia, the Ivory Coast, and Cameroon, and I hope that it will be a good basis for a debate afterwards, and that the different participants or the authors of the projects will be able to react to this. So without much more ado, I'm going to share my screen. So can you see the first slide? Is it working? So first of all, since this session is dealing with the determinants of inequality, I would like to focus with this first slide on this topic. It is quite a complex presentation, but let's say that if we want to understand inequalities as they exist today, the inequalities that refer to the well-being, we can have different ways of considering the past in order to try and understand those. There are some factors that are quite close in time to the well-being inequalities, such as the inequalities between social groups or individuals, or between different territories. And these are inequalities based on the resources or the assets, such as the economic wealth, the education, the health. And these inequalities based on assets have a yield that are leading to some inequalities of well-being. And then, of course, social policies that refer to the labor world, to the microeconomics elements, has an influence on the resources, and the resources can really be drivers. Then we should never forget that when we talk about inequalities, we're talking about a phenomenon that leads to many political moves, to many political initiatives. So we can say that inequalities by themselves can also give rise to political movements that by themselves could have an influence on the development of political platforms. So that's when we talk about the present. Now, if we think about the past, there are also long-term drivers concerning the resources and the assets that are the result of the interregional transmission of these assets, the land, and also education and health, and the resources. So we can say that even if you go back one generation, you're going to see inequalities of assets that led to inequalities in terms of well-being that could have an impact on the development on some policies. And this also happened in the past. If we go back much more in the past, in the history, we can observe that in all the countries of the world, there are institutions, you have structures of political, social and economic structures that have been the result of the geography on the one hand, so they are specific of the regions concerned, and also the result of their history. And these institutions or these departments, these structures that are things that cannot be changed from one day to the next, in fact, are also something that's going to have an impact on the development of policies. Inequalities, usually speaking, if we examine the topic of inequality, is something that is quite persistent. It is persistent, first of all, because the intergenerational transmission that I mentioned is something that's very strong. So inequalities that refer to the resources that were existing in the past are inequalities that are going to exist today as well, because they have been inherited. Then when we talk about growth and economic growth, this can reduce absolute poverty, of course, but quite often this also goes with an increase, sometimes a temporary one, of inequality. So the development of growth is not necessarily something that's going to really have an impact on inequalities. And finally, and I already mentioned this, you have the institutions, the political regimes, the social structures, the state institutions that do not change very quickly. And they change slowly, and they also condition the policies that are dealing with inequalities. No, so the change is slow, but I'm not saying that they do not change. And of course, the shocks, the historical shocks that we have experienced, that humanity has experienced in the past, have had some important impacts on inequalities. The Industrial Revolution, for instance, the political revolution, such as the French Revolution, that happened after or before this kind of industrial revolutions, colonialism as well, in the rest of the world by the European and Western countries, imperialism as well, that's usually also an illustration of colonialism, and then World War I and World War II and their aftermath. Then communism is also one of the consequences of World War I, so in particular in the Soviet Union, and then more recently in the 80s, what is considered to be the neoliberal turn that also had some very clear effects, particularly in the Western countries, in the US and in the UK, with an impact on inequalities. Now, we can wonder whether climate change could also be a historical shock that could have an impact, but we can also ask ourselves after colonialism if the movement of independence of countries that were in the past colonialized also is going to lead to some impacts. And I'm now showing you, and with this I come back to the present situation. So the picture of inequalities in Africa today. So on the left, on the right-hand side, sorry, you have a map of inequalities in Africa that are represented by the share of the 10% of the wealthiest people. So the incomes perceived by the 10% of the among the wealthiest people in the country. So there is this kind of north-south opposition. So the incomes are much higher in the north. And you have some factors that explain this situation. Now, if we examine on the left-hand side of the screen, sorry, the right-hand side, I usually have the tendency to invert right and left. So you can see that Africa as a continent, as compared to Brazil, India, or the Middle East, is not the continent that has more inequalities, but it is a continent where inequalities are quite quite strongly expressed. You have the share of 10% of the wealthiest people, for instance, and you have the lowest incomes for the 50% among the poorest. So Africa is different, is specific, because of the ratio between the share received by the 10% of the wealthiest people as compared to the share received by the 50% of poor people. So it is the dualism. So it is a big difference between this 10% at the highest level of the distribution of incomes and the lower level that represents 50% of poor people. And at the bottom, you can see that in Africa, you have a specific indicator of dualism that is much higher as compared to the situation in the other regions or countries. So this dualism, the origin of this dualism, can be traced back to colonial times. So these graphics are the result of a study that is available on the internet. So the title is at the bottom of the slide. So here you have the representation on a timeline that goes from 1920 up to 1960 on the left, to a timeline going from 1945 to 1960 on the right. The evolution, most of them in Africa, but not only, because you also have Vietnam, for instance. So you can see the evolution of the share, not of the 10% of the wealthiest, but the 0.1% of the richest people. So the objective of these pictures is to show that the inequality of incomes during colonial times was very strong. And you can also see that it seems that there is a trend downwards, particularly after the war, so after 1945. And the paper I refer to shows that essentially the decrease is due to the decrease of inequalities between the Europeans who were present in the colonies. So it is a mirror of the decrease of inequalities that happened in France or in the UK that you can also observe here, and not the result of a reduction of the difference between the Europeans and the people who were colonized in those countries. Now, very quickly, dualism in some colonial societies: Tunisia between 1946 and 56, Cameroon in 1945, and South Africa between 1956 and 1986. It was not colonial times anymore in 86, but it was still the time of the apartheid. So in general terms, all these pictures aim at showing you that in the case of Tunisia, for instance, that inequalities were moderate between Tunisians. If you examine the inequalities between Tunisians, between 10% of Europeans living there in Tunisia, the inequalities were also moderate, but the difference was particularly between the Europeans and the local people, because they were earning 8 times more than local people. Now, were there Tunisians who were at the top? Indeed, there were some 20% of the top 1%, even in colonial times, as you can see it in the graphic that I'm underlying with the mouse. And so there were 20% of the top 1%, but they were also representing 90% of the population. You can find the same situation in Cameroon, so there the differences between the Europeans and the locals is stronger. And in South Africa, the 20% that you find in Tunisia is reduced to 2%. Only 2% of Black South African people who are part of the top 1% in Africa until 1986. Now, this dualism is persistent. Why? Well, because even if we think about the colonial times, 60% of the wealthy Tunisians were salaried workers, but during colonial times, they were discriminated probably in terms of wages, but after 45, there was a reduction of the wages discrimination, and it helped the privileged Tunisians. There were the civil servants, for instance, and this has made the difference stronger between those privileged Tunisians and the rest of the population. For instance, a Tunisian civil servant in colonial times and a worker, an average worker in Tunisia, there's a difference of 4 or 7 times in terms of salary. Now, after the independence was essentially a political independence, not only economic. And when independence happened in most countries that were colonized in Africa, more specifically, we can see that there is the financial bourgeoisie, industrial bourgeoisie, but you're going to see a bureaucratic bourgeoisie that's going to emerge. It's been mentioned by some authors, by some Marxists, such as Frantz Fanon, Samir Amin, and René Dumont, and they criticize the emergence of this bourgeoisie. It is a new kind of bourgeoisie that takes advantage of the expansion of the public sector after colonial times, and in a way we can say that they have inherited colonial times and decolonizations as well. For instance, in 1955, you have 12,000 civil servants in the colonial administration in Tunisia. In 1960, 4 years later, you have 80,000 civil servants in the Tunisian civil service. And unfortunately, the speaker is gone. Maybe we can come back to this when we have a debate afterwards. I'm trying to switch to the next slide, says the speaker. So just a few points concerning tax matters, and we can come back to this later. It's very important to talk about taxation because one of the most efficient ways to reduce inequalities is probably to have a better taxation system and a better distribution. Now, the increase of taxation capabilities requires specific investments. And still today in the developing countries, particularly in Africa, you have a dualist system when you talk about the tax regime, because you have a taxation system that is essentially based on the most modern or the most formal or the more privileged part of the population. So it is the VAT, taxes on incomes or taxes on land. So we observe that the privileged elite is going to resist to the reform of taxation because it affects them much more strongly. So you can see here with this table, it is difficult to read it, but you can see the reduced progress, generally speaking, in the former colonies of France in Africa between colonial times and today. So concerning this fiscal capacity, if we compare this to the taxes imposed on oil products or mining products. And I'm going to end my presentation by raising a question, and it's a question that I invite you to think about. So my question is whether those elements of dualism that were probably essential in order to better understand colonial times and decolonization and the period just after decolonization, so if these dualism elements are now less important today. I think that we don't know much, in fact, about the way the privileged classes that came after, that emerged after decolonization evolved. But there are some elements concerning the Ivory Coast, for instance, I would have some elements that I could develop, but I don't have the time. But you can see in blue the analysis of inequalities in 2014 in the Ivory Coast. So the glass is half full and half empty. So you have the civil servants, you have the workers protected, but in the top 20%, you also have the share, the demographic share of these people that is reduced, and there is a progressive informalization of this top 20%. And I'm going to stop with this. Thank you for your attention. Well, no problem whatsoever. It was very interesting. I have a question, but I'm going to keep it for when we have the panel afterwards, because indeed we're going to try and respect the time. Now, I'd like to introduce another speaker, but unfortunately we had some problems with the internet connection, so we're just going to hear that speaker. We're not going to see him. But I think that the voice will be going through perfectly well. So we're going to listen to Mr. Mongi Boughzala, who is a teacher at the University of Tunis and Manar, and he was the leader of the team that researched inequalities and social capital in Tunisia. Unfortunately, today we have problems. There are some internet problems close to his home, so I hope that Mr. Mongi Boughzala is with us and that we can listen to you.
We cannot hear you yet, Mr. Boughzala. Could you please activate your microphone? Now it's perfect. Thank you. Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be with you this afternoon and to give you this presentation about the work carried out by our team. A team including myself, Professor El Laga, and our two assistants, Mrs. Ines Bouhzala and Mr. Ferjani. And I would like to greet them. Our work has looked into historical factors, and I'll tell you in a moment what I mean by that. But first and foremost, I would like to tell you that for Tunisia, the problem of inequalities is not a new one. And the previous speaker just reminded us of the fact that this problem existed in the colonial era, and it has always existed. And I would also like to say that I welcome this intervention because it explains that history has a major role to play, and this is what I will tell you about. In Tunisia, the problem of inequalities has become more concerning ever since 2011, which is the year of the revolution, which doesn't mean that there were no inequalities before, but ever since 2011, these inequalities have become a priority, and it has become one of the most important concerns of the country. It has become our main challenge. And this is due to the fact that inequalities have evolved with the changes in the country and the increase in the unemployment rate for young people who started this revolution. This being said, I would like to remind you of the fact that for these people and for the majority of Tunisian people, inequalities are considered to be something unfair. And it is true that inequalities are not fair because they reflect unequal opportunities. These inequalities also reflect conditions that are not controlled by people who are victims of those inequalities. And this idea of equal opportunities is at the center of our work. Now, I'd like to move on to my second slide, simply to tell you that this idea of equal opportunities is at the heart of our work, but we also looked at the importance of the historic factor. And for us, this means that we need to take into account the inherited human capital, as we call it, and the social capital. I'll tell you a few words about this in a moment. That this is not a new idea, but we believe that the consideration and the taking into account of this human capital is something new compared to social capital. This is a notion that we can find in many places in literature. And the idea of the importance of this historic factor finds inspiration in the works of Michael Porter in 1990 about the competitive advantage of nations. There would be a competitive advantage to industries and countries related to their geographical spaces, and they're limited to their values, culture, and their history. And this would be at the origin of the competitive advantage of nations, regions, or cities. And in Tunisia, apart from inequalities and differences between different social groups of the population, and it's certainly the case in other countries, there are also inequalities between regions. And these interregional inequalities seem to cause a lot of instability, a lot of concerns, because we know that in the western part of the country, we have more disadvantaged people compared to the coastal areas, especially in the northeast of the country and the central and eastern part of the country. But it's not sufficient to identify those differences. We also know that from a historical point of view, those regions, the West and the East, evolved very differently throughout history. And we can say that the population in the coastal areas in the East were more open to the rest of the world. They also developed a certain number of skills and complex know-how. They also had a very rich amount of activities. They were more diversified compared to the western part of the country. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that you do not have cities in the West, but the situation is different. And if you go back in time to the Roman times, you will see that there were cities, but many were destroyed throughout history. So this is the basic observation. There is a historical difference between the West and the East. And in the East, you have a more significant heritage, and the region is richer. Now, when we talk about inherited human capital, we refer to the immaterial heritage. So that's the competence, the skills, the know-how of people. And that knowledge is inherited from parents, grandparents, great-great-parents. So this is the know-how you can find in the population today. And we know that human capital is important. Everyone will say that. It is clear from many analyses and studies. Human capital is important. But here we want to make a distinction between two components. We have the acquired human capital, which is based on education and the training that you receive in schools, and the inherited human capital that is a result of this generational transfer. So this is something that you can receive from your parents and your grandparents. So it has a more local dimension. Now, I'm sorry because I cannot tell you when I'm moving to the next slide. So I'm currently trying to give you an explanation of the inherited human capital. So this, what you could see on my slide. Now let's move on to social capital. This is a well-known concept. It is widely used, even though there are many different definitions. And the definition that we use is the one that seems to be the most appropriate definition. It comes from a group of researchers with Mr. Sapienza and Zingales. I'm not going to give you all the references because we do not have enough time, but we believe that this is the most appropriate definition of social capital because it really highlights the values and the beliefs that are shared by the members of a community. And because of those values, the members of the community can trust one another. So it determines the level of cohesion and the level of trust. And this also facilitates the exchanges. It facilitates consensus and reaching an agreement. It's important for investment, for growth, and for the development of the country. But of course, it also depends on the scope and the size of the community, because you can have trust in a very small community, and that's not sufficient. It is very important to have a wide community, and people need to be able to trust one another on a very wide territory. And that's the idea of social capital. Now, I see that time is flying, so I need to speed up. Now, of course, this is not the only driver of inequalities. In our work, we have also looked at all other inequality drivers. We have economic factors, geographical factors, as opposed to historical drivers. Now, I'd like to move on to the next slide, talking about geographical and economic factors. There are many of them, and I do not have enough time to mention all of them. I would like to focus on some of them only. So there are macroeconomic factors, such as economic growth and demographic developments and evolutions. Then education, which is a very important driver. The initial distribution of wealth, access to capital and sources of funding, the tax policy, social security and its development, the quality and the spatial distribution of public infrastructure and investment. And all of this will determine private investments. And that's a very important driver to generate income and employment. Unfortunately, I do not have enough time to go into the details. But I'd like to tell you that the demographic and economic growth is a factor that actually contributed to a reduction of inequalities. In the last 30 to 40 years, we've had a decrease in inequalities between regions, between social groups, whatever the indicator that we use, whatever the measurements. We also had a demographic transition compared to other sub-Saharan countries. The demographic growth rate is decreasing, and this contributes to the reduction of inequalities. I would like to say a few words about education. In Tunisia, there has been an increase in the access to education. Education has become more democratic, more affordable, but there are still many differences between communities and between regions. And we also know that there is a phenomenon that is referring to the transmission between generations. So people, children, young people coming from disadvantaged areas are exposed to the risk of poverty. They are unlikely to study, and even if they study, they may not have access to higher education, to universities. So their opportunities are more limited, and it will be more difficult for them to have access to employment. And this is all the more true for girls. However, there have been changes. Girls are going to school, they're very successful. the problem is this is not reflected in the labor market. There are still many inequalities, inequalities between regions mainly. So there are differences between the western and the eastern parts of the country. And that's because of the environment in which those children are raised. And I believe that this is the most serious matter. This is really a major driver of inequalities in terms of opportunities. And this is something that I will mention at the end of my presentation when I come to recommendations. Now, when it comes to capital, initial wealth, there are inequalities, of course, even though the data is quite limited about those assets. We have some figures about the level of expenditure and income, especially because studies were carried out to analyze consumption, and we have reliable data dating back to the 80s. There were surveys starting in the 60s. The data that we have show that there is a concentration of wealth and difficulties when having to access capital for those who are already poor or poorer than others. And the tax policy is not improving the situation. There is a lot of tax evasion in the country. And it's easier to get taxes from wage earners compared to other workers. So this tax policy is not playing its part to redistribute wealth. The social policy is trying to solve this problem and this unbalance, but its impact is quite limited. Now, we also looked at available data to analyze another factor that is quite important in my view. I think it's quite important from a political and economic point of view, and that's the regional distribution of public investments. So the distribution of investments in different regions, different areas. We can see there are still many inequalities, non-monetary inequalities mainly. And in Tunisia, ever since the 90s, efforts have been made in order to increase the share of public investments allocated to disadvantaged regions. But this was not sufficient to change the situation, and it has a very important impact. It's not sufficient to increase the share of public investments to have things change. No, this needs to be enshrined in a development plan. And the regional development conditions need to be fulfilled. This is a prerequisite, and it's not sufficient. Public investments were often not targeted, they were not well coordinated, they were not included in a plan promoting new activities and ensuring convergence and the striking of a new balance. So unfortunately, that policy has not been very efficient. It's not sufficient to invest more in vulnerable regions. No, you also need to make sure that these investments are allocated in a harmonious way. And that's why private investment, employment, and income are concentrated in the coastal areas, in the most advantaged regions. And this has never changed ever since the revolution. Most investments are taking place in the northeast region, so in Tunis, Sfax, Mabou, Sousse, Gamès, and not in the other regions. Now, I'd like to move on to the historical drivers. So this is the element that is the most important in the contribution that we've made through this work. It is the most original aspect of our work. So we've tried to analyze the data that we collected thanks to a survey carried out in the framework of this project. And it was possible for us to test the importance of the inherited human capital and the importance of social capital. Now, when it comes to the inherited human capital, the results are very clear, and they show and confirm the importance of inherited human capital as a driver explaining inequalities, and especially inequalities between regions and inequalities existing between different communities within one region. And this also reveals the importance of the transmission of knowledge between generations and the importance of transmitting and sharing immaterial heritage. And this is a driver that is added to the others. And I believe that this is the most important result. We have been able to confirm from a very empirical point of view, in a very objective way, the importance of inherited human capital. Now, it cannot explain everything, but really this knowledge, this heritage are important drivers. And their capacity to become entrepreneurs comes from that human capital. You have many entrepreneurs coming from Nabil, from Sfax, from Tunis, and other cities in this area, because there is a very strong link between this inherited human capital, the knowledge, the know-how, the skills that you have inherited from your parents, your grandparents, skills that existed for hundreds of years, sometimes thousands of years. So there's a link between that inheritance and the capacity to create jobs and to set up your own company, your own business. Now, of course, it doesn't mean that we should say, well, there's nothing to be done about disadvantaged regions. Then there's nothing we can do for them, too bad for them. No, of course. What I mean is that if we want to develop those regions, if we want to adopt an efficient regional policy, we need to take that into account. And we need to follow an approach to strike a new balance between those regions. We need to prepare those populations so that they can develop these new activities. They need to acquire knowledge, to use new technologies. They need to be prepared to new institutions. They need to be ready for that. For example, if you want to develop tourism in a region where most of the populations is made of farmers or breeders who've been used to really breeding cattle and nothing else, and who have never had contact with people from the outside world. Well, they need to be trained. They need to be prepared before you can develop tourism. Otherwise, it would not be successful. Mr. Boughzala, I'm sorry to interrupt, but you're being a little too long, and I see that you still have many slides to share with us. So I would like to ask you to keep that information for later. I'm sure there will be questions later on. So I'm very sorry, but I need to interrupt you. Otherwise, we won't be able to stick to the time frame and the time we have. So I would like to thank you very much for your contribution. I have a question for you, but I'll keep it for later when we have our panel discussion. And I would like to introduce Kofi Christian Enda, who's going to tell us about his project about inequalities in access to basic services and impact of public policies in Côte d'Ivoire. So I would like to give you the floor immediately, Mr. Enda.
Good afternoon to you all. So we're going to... Can you hear me? So I was saying that we are going to present to you today the project on inequalities It was part of a global project about inequalities in the Ivory Coast, inequalities in access to basic services and impact of public policies in the Ivory Coast. So it should be mentioned here that as far as the context is concerned, in the last year, since 2012 in Ivory Coast, we observed that economic performance is very good. We have more or less 8% of increase per year. However, inequalities are not reducing in the same way if we take into account the economic growth. So in 2002, the inequality level was of 49. In 2008, 42.0, and in 2019, 40%. So it is not substantial, taking into account the improvement of economic growth. So the objective of the research was to analyze the phenomenon that is accompanying this kind of inequalities, taking into account these very strong economic growth. For us, it was something that was inconsistent, and we wanted to understand what was the situation. So the project is based on different steps. The first step was to have a diagnosis, or to take stock of these inequalities, to try and better understand why we had those inequalities, the different kind of inequalities, and also where these inequalities were present. And in order to do that, we've used a description statistics system, and we've analyzed the different places where the situation happens. So we've compared the situation of the household on the basis of the figures of the National Institute, so we could see what were the inequalities. And as you can see in the maps on the screen, is that you have different inequalities according to the region. And the regions that are more affected by the inequalities are the regions of the south, in a stronger color, and also in the center of the country. And then you can see the evolution in 2015. So this is the kind of map that called our attention. So the question for us was to know, how can we explain these inequalities? And before answering to this question, we tried to know what could be the contribution of the crisis experienced by the Ivory Coast starting in 2002. We indeed had a crisis until 2008, a political crisis. So we tried to understand what could be the contribution of that kind of crisis in the evolution of inequality starting in 2008 until 2015. And in order to do that, we have used the treatment effect analysis, and we considered that as the country was divided into two parts, starting in September 2002 until April 2007, we considered that maybe some populations were displaced because there were some areas in the north that were under the control of the revolution movement, and you had some other parts in the south. And of course, this could have an impact on inequalities. And the study has shown that, in fact, if we do not take into account these displacements, we were underestimating the impact on inequalities. So we were convinced that the crisis indeed had a very strong impact on inequalities, and therefore we have tried to understand better what were the elements that could explain the inequalities after the crisis. And in doing so, we have focused on some factors using the databases of 2008 and 2015 on households. So as a first step, we have used an equation applied to the incomes, and then we have also applied a formula to calculate and identify the factors that could give explanations on inequalities. And we realized that in the Ivory Coast, the factors that can better explain inequalities is the access to drinkable water, education, the kind of housing, the place where people reside, whether they live in an urban area or in a rural area, also the gender, the employment situation, and the access to electricity, to power. So these are factors that can explain the inequalities in the Ivory Coast. And we've also used the Gini index, and we've tried to focus on different elements. And the results show that the Gini results are in agreement with the factors that we have used. So we've also used the Atkinson index. Then another point was what could be the impact of public policies, of social policies on these inequalities. So we have used a dynamic model, and with this we could carry out some simulations to try and better understand what could be the impact of public policies on the inequalities observed. So when doing this work, we've used as a simulation basis what is recommended in the development program. And we've also used as a basis for our simulation the objectives in the field of health education related to the SDGs. And with this, we could observe that generally speaking, in spite of the situation of health and social protection, there was an increase of inequalities. And on that basis, we have tried to prepare some recommendations related to these factors that explain the inequalities. So next slide, please. So here we have some recommendations, recommendations that essentially concern the access to basic facilities, basic infrastructure, because this access should be a priority if we want to fight against inequalities. We also have to focus on the access to education and employment, and also the access to housing. So this should be part and parcel of the public policies to fight against inequalities. But we also have to focus, to target some specific areas, some specific disadvantaged groups. So, for instance, we do not have to develop basic infrastructure in some privileged neighborhoods. No, we have to do that in the rural areas, for instance, where you have more problems and more disadvantaged groups in order to have a better balance between the different groups. And as a conclusion, if you allow me, I'd like to add that this presentation was supposed to be made by Professor Akabedia, who was the project leader. He was the one to carry out the project starting in 2018 until its end in October 2020. But unfortunately, he left us in March, on the 14th of March 2021. And so I'm replacing him to tell you about this project so that you have an idea about the main aspects of this project that he could develop during those 2 years. So thank you very much for your attention. And of course, I'm here to answer to your questions if you have some questions. Well, thank you very much. I'm quite sure that he would be very proud of you because you did that very, very well. And thank you also for paying tribute to him. I have indeed a question. What are the public policy tools that you recommend to remedy to regional imbalances, to regional inequalities? Well, as far as the public policies are concerned, what we recommend is that we focus on basic services. So we're talking about access to water and power. All the rest, that is education and the other things, can happen once people have access to water and power. And learners can better follow their education because they have access to water and because they have access to electricity. Drinkable water is very important. And we have to think that the fact that we have more drinkable water is going to reduce the problems of health. And this is going to reduce the problems of the children or students attending the school they can go to. Well, thank you very much. Please stay with us because we have the panel afterwards. So thank you very much, Mr. Kofi Christian. So we're now going to travel to Cameroon and we're going to listen to the presentation on a project on structural change, growth models and inequalities in Cameroon. And we have with us Isaac Temba of the National Institute of Statistics of Cameroon. So the floor is yours, Mr. Temba. Well, I'm not from the National Institute of Statistics. In fact, I'm from the university. I'm a teacher at a university in the field of economics. So I'm here rather as the president of the scientific committee of the Research Facility on Equalities in Cameroon. And it's a hat the hat that I'm wearing because I'm working on economics. It is a research project that we have carried out with the public administrations responsible for inequalities, the Ministry for Economics, for instance, the National Institute of Statistics, because of the databases on the households for the year 2001, 2007, and 2014. And we've also worked with the research leaders of the university. So we had some mixed teams. So we had statistics experts, university professors, and also people who are part and parcel of the decision process at the economics department and dealing with public affairs. So as I said, we have this research facility project, and we had 4 topics for this research. First of all, I'm going to tell you about the first point. Then I'm going to tell about the subsidies and then about structural changes still related to inequalities. And then I will talk about the informality and inequalities. It was a pleasure for us to be leaders of the scientific committee. And the topic for this presentation is on the inequality drivers in Cameroon. So as you know, I don't know whether you can see the slides already. Yes, we can see your slides. So, as you know, inequalities is one of the expression of precariousness, and it is one of the strongest expression of this precariousness in our country. There is a problem of inequalities in terms of income, and it is really a challenge for us in our country, because it refers to concepts such as the exclusion, people excluded from public policies, from growth, or excluded from everything. So in emerging countries like ours, what is important is to be able to reduce poverty and to attack the problem of inequalities. In Cameroon, in the last years, we've observed an unusual increase of inequalities. And this led us to develop this research project. We should also be aware that the events we've been going through in 2008, the hunger crisis, and also the problems we've had since 2014, and more recently, since 2018, all the problems of security in the country, and also the problems of terrorist threats are also elements that can explain inequalities. So this was really the context, because if you want to understand inequalities and why they have increased so much in the last years, 0.44 in 2014, for instance. So this is explained by all these problems that I have mentioned, and the research team has therefore carried out a part of this study, and I'm going to explain the main results of this study. Inequality in terms of expenses. So there was a slight increase during the period between 1996 and 2001. As you can see it on the slide, so the inequality of expenses has slightly increased during that period, and there was a marginal decrease between 2001 and 2007. And afterwards, it strongly increased between 2007 and 2014. So we're talking about important cycles, because the first one is the period was that of initiatives for indebted countries with a strategic plan for the reduction of poverty, while the period 2007-2014 is more a time of post-adjustment with the development of big structural projects. And of course, this can also explain why inequalities have increased during that period of time. The second result that is important and should be mentioned here is that when inequality decreases, as it was the case between 2001 and 2007, well, this reduction is stronger in the urban areas as compared to the rural areas. So we've observed that the place of residence is an important driver of inequalities in Cameroon. The third essential result is that when we observe this kind of evolution of inequalities, as it is the case between 1996 and 2001, we observe that inequalities decrease proportionally in urban areas while it increases in rural areas. So this strengthens furthermore the idea according to which the place of residence is really an important driver for inequalities. Now, concerning the period 2007-2014, we've observed that inequalities have increased in both regions, in both kind of areas. And afterwards, after this presentation, after the presentation of the results that highlight the place of residence, as well as the fact that the education of the household head is a main driver, we can also mention that during the COVID-19 period, there was a stronger increase of income inequalities, most probably because of the increase of unemployment. And this led, of course, to job losses, particularly in some sectors of the national economy, such as the hospitality sector, the catering sector, leisures and services, particularly the tertiary sectors. Now, we've also observed as a fundamental result that there are stronger inequalities in the urban areas as compared to the rural areas. And this could explain the exponential increase of these inequalities in the urban areas because there was a demographic pressure in the urban areas. There were also internal migration flows, and these all combined represent a very strong pressure on labor, and more specifically on social, educational infrastructures that are not sufficient. So we think that if urban areas are a place where there are many inequalities in the last years, it's because of the demographic pressure, because of the migration flows that are faced with the lack of infrastructure and also the lack of decent jobs. and the lack of educational and social infrastructures. So on that basis, we have some recommendations that we have prepared. The first recommendation is that we have to improve the education levels, particularly among the poorest groups, in order to contribute to the promotion of equality in education, and by doing that, to foster economic growth. Last year, in the framework of the plan to fight against the COVID-19, the government established some mitigation measures to fight against the pandemics. And it is the poor households that were really targeted. Now, of course, we have to also create employment opportunities for workers, and we also have to create opportunities for self-employment. The third recommendation is that we have to foster a more egalitarian development between rural and urban areas in order to reduce inequalities of expenses in Cameroon. This kind of inclusive development would strengthen the economic integration between the different regions that are lagging behind, some regions where we observe more equalities and the others that are more on the front line. And so we can really have a policy that's going to make it possible to compensate for the lack of social and educational infrastructures, and also to establish some other services. So our recommendation is that efficient policies to reduce inequalities in Cameroon should target inequalities between the different circles, the different areas, and within those circles and those areas, and also the inequalities between the regions and within the regions. Now, the last slide you have now on the screen aims at showing that as far as the fight against the pandemics, and the fight against inequalities as well, the economic policies that should be developed in the coming years in our country should essentially target the poorest households. So this is a summary of the results and the main recommendations of this study. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tamba. I would like to suggest something, because we haven't had any specific questions to you, but there are many questions that were raised for the panel. So I suggest we now have a 5-minute break, but I'd like to ask you to really stick to 5 minutes, because our last speaker is ready. She's going to tell you about the next steps, because we've now listened to these presentations by the members of the panel, and I would like to thank you very much. So please come back here in 5 minutes at 3:45. Thank you.
From AFD, Agence Française de Développement, we want to tell you what the EU AFD Research Facility on Inequalities is, the projects we are carrying out, and our main research findings. The EU AFD Research Facility on Equalities is a programme funded by the European Commission and managed by AFD, aiming to improve knowledge and understanding of economic and social inequalities, their determinants and underlying mechanisms at different spatial levels, as well as the most effective policies and approaches to reduce them. With a budget of €4 million for the period 2017 to 2020 and a steering committee comprised of the European Commission, AFD and AECID, the Spanish cooperation, the programme launched more than 20 research projects in over 20 countries.
Well, thank you very much for being back. I suggest we now listen to our discussant, Françoise Rivière. She's a doctor in development economy, and her work first focused on the effects of public expenditure on infrastructure and education from a macro and microeconomic point of view. Today, she is the head of the Economy and Strategy Unit of the Africa Department in AFD, and she will shed light on the way these results can contribute to operation and strategies for development. Mrs. Rivière, you have the floor. Well, good afternoon to all of you. Can you hear me? Yes. Yes, and we can see you. Absolutely. Well, I would like to thank the Department for Research for inviting me to take the floor during this session. So without any further ado, I would like to start my presentation. All right, so you'll be managing your slides, if I'm not mistaken. Yes. So my presentation will look at the role of a development agency such as AFD, so the role we can play to reduce inequalities, and we're going to talk about the tools that are available for donors in order to fight against these inequalities. Now, unfortunately, I cannot see my slides. That's disturbing. Now, just a brief reminder about Africa. Africa is the continent where we will have to really make efforts to reach SDGs at global level. And Africa is the second continent where you have the most inequalities after Latin America. We know there is a very important demographic challenge with young people, because young people less than 25 years old represents more than half of the population in Africa until 2050. And as it was said by different speakers, inequalities have to be considered under their various forms. Inequalities in terms of opportunities. You also have economic opportunities, horizontal inequalities between men and women, territorial inequalities, and Africa is the geographical priority of the AFD group because it represents 50% of our commitments every year, 6.7 billion euros in 2015 with the 4 islands of the Indian Ocean. And this AFD group is implemented an all for Africa approach. So it is really important to think about these processes, and 44 African countries receive this support through projects. So it's really important for us to think about the development process in Africa. What are the public policies? What are the sustainable investments to be made? What are the policies we need to develop? And how can a donor act and intervene to reduce inequalities? Because as Denis Cogneau said in his introduction, these inequalities are mainly structural inequalities. Now, just a few words about the COVID crisis, because it was briefly mentioned. And of course, the impacts of the COVID crisis will aggravate and worsen pre-existing inequalities. There will be an impact on SMEs, very small enterprises, and that impact could be significant and lead to important job losses. And we just heard about Cameroon. And the economic shock could also lead to a social fragilization of society. Now, AFD published about 2 months ago an article talking about the 4 long-term challenges for a sustainable recovery. So we need to look at the resilience. We need to improve the funding capacity of states because, of course, that capacity will have an influence on their capacity of investing in basic services, quality services, services for all. But of course, we should not neglect the aspects related to the creation of activities, because we cannot create wealth without creating activities upstream. And the third challenge will be to increase economic diversification, because many African countries depend on raw materials. And then we also need to speed up regional integration in order to reduce their dependence on foreign markets. So these are the 4 challenges that have been identified in the works carried out by AFD. Now, I would like to tell you about the social link strategy that was adopted 2 weeks ago by the AFD group. The first objective of this strategy is to achieve the commitments of AFD, the commitments made in the framework of the Paris Agreements. And the first objective is to reduce inequalities, wealth inequalities from a horizontal and vertical point of view. And the second aspect aims at reinforcing inclusion by taking into account the different contexts and circumstances. And we've listened to different interventions today, and we've heard that these public policies, these social policies fighting against inequalities are enshrined in political, historical, sociological contexts with different types of governance, of course, very specific to each country. Now, the first objective is to reduce inequalities, and this can be divided into 3 aspects. First, promoting fair access to goods and services that are essential for all. Then the second axis is supporting social justice and redistribution policies, and finally promoting equality between men and women. When it comes to the first field of action, we want to work on health, sexual health, reproductive health, reinforcement of health systems, social protection, that is an essential component of resilience of individuals and communities facing shocks and crises, then providing access to goods and services. And then, of course, we also need to promote education, training, and employment. And AFD would like to put emphasis on young people and women. And I'd like to give you some examples of recent projects. In Togo, there was a subsidy aiming at funding the universal income for solidarity in favor of the informal sector that was affected by the restrictions measures adopted because of the pandemic. In Mauritania, a subsidy to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of the national social protection system, covering the poor and vulnerable households, including refugees. So 207,000 households. And in Egypt, there was a loan in order to develop an efficient universal health insurance system. Then we have another aspect related to access to essential goods and services to improve the living conditions of populations, food, water, sanitation, mobility, housing, and digital technologies in order to make sure that territories are no longer isolated. We've talked a lot about equality between territories. We've talked about this unbalance between rural and urban areas, and so it is important to promote these policies in order to reduce these territorial inequalities. And then I'd to come back to what I said about creating activities. We need to promote access to economic opportunities, financial opportunities with basic financial services. Now, the second aspect aims at supporting social justice and redistribution policies. I already mentioned social protection, so I'm not going to repeat that. We also want to promote public tax policies in order to use progressive tax policies. Now, it doesn't mean that donors are going to intervene in the choices to be made by governments, and I'll come back to that later. But I believe it is important to start a dialogue, and this is what AFD intends to do with several countries. And we're also trying to support a better financial governance in order to better mobilize domestic resources and optimize public finance. Then finally, we would like to promote gender equality, promoting access to basic services. As I said before, we also want to eradicate all forms of violence, physical, psychological, economic, and legal victim violence. And the group will also try to ensure the translation and the transcription of international law on human rights in the national common law of the partner countries. And then, of course, I believe that public banks should play an increasing role in policies aiming at reducing inequalities. The public banks fund 10% of global investments, 95% on the African continent. And I'm sorry, but I believe this is not the right slide. Let me check. I'm very sorry for this technical problem. I'm trying to solve this between my computer and my phone. So there are 95 on the African continent, and this could become a leverage to fund public policies with projects that are in line with SDGs. This will enable us to mobilize domestic savings, to intervene against the different cycles, to fund projects that would have an important impact on social, economic, and environmental issues. I can mention the initiative called Santé en commun, and AFD has decided to work on a series of national plans. We also aim at reinforcing the development public banks in African countries. And you could have the example of the BOAD, for example, with credit lines. And the AFD also launched a dialogue around public policies with governments, with a strategic dialogue memorandum with Côte d'Ivoire, Tunisia, Morocco, and Mali. So we're working with governments and local researchers in order to develop studies together, and we develop the topics together, and the results can then lead to discussions and exchange about the consequences and the implications in terms of public policies. And I would like to conclude by saying that, and I believe that this came clearly out of the three studies that were presented, and I read them from Cameroon, Tunisia, and Côte d'Ivoire. We always realized that social policies, tax policies do not always reach the most vulnerable groups. Sometimes there is a bias with privileged populations benefiting from these advantages in terms of health and education. And sometimes donors tend to increase inequalities. So if we want development aid to be efficient, we need to make sure that it is targeted. So the assistance has to be targeted. And this is one of the recommendations we had today. We really need to target the most vulnerable populations, and institutions in partner countries need to make sure that the funds available do reach the populations that really need them. Well, thank you very much, Mrs. Rivière. You were able to stick to the time you had. Thank you very much. And I guess it was not easy for you to manage the slides between your computer and your phone, but you did great. So thank you very much for that. And in the meantime, of course, the members of the panel are still with us. And I believe it is also a pleasure for us to welcome Mr. Boughzala, who is back with us with his camera on. And I think that's very nice for us to see all of you. Now, I would like to talk more about regional inequalities and public policies to be developed with the members of the panel. But first, I'd like to turn to you as members of the panel, because you listened to the presentations of the other speakers, and I would like to know if you have a question to ask to the other panelists. So please raise your hand, wave at me if you have a question. Now, if you have no questions, I have a list of questions that we received, but I would like to turn to you first. So do you have any questions? If you have no questions, I'd like to ask the first one to Mr. Boughzala. You've talked briefly about the fact that you included inequalities between men and women in your work. And we would like to know how you did that. And I would like to know if the level of gender inequality is different from one region to the other. Yes, absolutely. Now, first, as to our methodology, I would say that we simply collected data. We used documents and reports looking into the gender issue. And on top of that, we used data related to employment. They're more relevant when it comes to access to labor market by women. I believe that these are the most important figures. They reveal the inequalities to the detriment of women. This is what I mentioned at the beginning of my intervention. Girls have made great progress in terms of education. They are more successful than boys in terms of education. However, when they turn to the labor market, we can see that 75% of women are not active. They're still outside of the labor market, and it's very difficult for them to find a job. And the problem is more significant for women who had access to higher education. The unemployment rate is very high, especially in the most disadvantaged areas, because employment opportunities are more limited. The number of companies creating jobs is more limited. There might be a cultural explanation, but I believe that the main reason is the lack of decent jobs, quality jobs. You know, in many families, people prefer having their girls at home instead of sending their girls to informal jobs with poor working conditions, poor quality, poor security, and very low wages. So indeed, there are results showing that inequality, but this is not the aspect we were able to develop the most because of a lack of data. So we mainly focused on inequality drivers in relation to this social capital and the inherited human capital that I didn't have the time to develop thoroughly. And I would like to apologize once more for the poor connection. I couldn't see you earlier, so it was very strange. Yes, I fully understand, and I'm very sorry for being rude. I had to interrupt you in your intervention, but you really had to stick to the time and to the schedule. So to come back to this, I would like to ask another question to Mr. Cogneau, but I believe that Mr. Tamba could also react on this. There is a question. What is the link between gender inequalities and spatial inequalities and tax policies in countries such as Cameroon, where the informal sector is a majority. Mr. Cogneau, you have the floor.
Well, the question is very wide, in fact, because it refers to many different aspects. So is there a link between inequalities based on gender and based on space and taxation? Well, in a way, the problem of taxation as such is, as I said, the fact that when we talk about taxation that is not related to natural resources, i.e. oil or mining products, it is a taxation that is relatively modern, in inverted commas, as it is called. It is a dualist system because it is difficult for it to extend to all the territories, and it is also essentially focusing on the cities, essentially. There are some exceptions, of course. And it's difficult for it to progress because, as I've shown in the tables that you've seen in my presentation, there are some countries such as Morocco or Tunisia that have indeed this kind of progress. But let's say that taxation can be escaped by the wealthiest. In the surveys carried out in Dakar, for instance, we've seen that only 20% of the landowners in Dakar are paying land taxes, or that are detected by the fiscal authorities. So there are inequalities in terms of tax contributions, but within a territory like Dakar, for instance, there are also inequalities in terms of contribution to the taxation system. And as I said, we talk about VAT. VAT applies differently. Well, normally it affects all the consumers, but if you use products in the informal sector, for instance, you're not going to pay for the VAT. You only pay on the VAT related to the inputs of the informal sector. And I have some colleagues who've demonstrated that taxation, the indirect taxation on consumption, is not as regressive as what we might imagine because of this dualism and because of those differences between the informal sector, that is where the VAT is not applied, and the formal sector where it is applied. So from a political point of view, as it is essentially workers and entrepreneurs of the formal sector who have more power in political terms, it explains why it's difficult for the VAT to increase. Because if it were to increase, it would have an impact on those categories, and those categories can indeed have an impact on the decisions to increase the VAT. Now, concerning gender, I think that gender refers more to topics such as education and the access to education. It was a very good example that was mentioned by Mr. Boughzala concerning Tunisia. So the access to education is not the same for women and men, for girls and boys. So this requires, at the same time, to have a taxation system that's going to be used for the educational system. Or you have to have development aid, but you need money in order to increase the number of schools, to appoint teachers, and so on and so forth. So thank you. So the person who was raising this question was referring to Cameroon. So Mr. Tamla, would you like to add something and explain us how it works in Cameroon? Well, thank you very much. It's been already said that this point was not dealt with in the project in Cameroon, but at first sight, we could think that there is no direct relationship between between taxation and gender realities, as it's been mentioned by Professor Cogneau. And also we have the informal sector. You know, a large part of the economy is in the informal sector. And you have production and economic units that escape the taxation regime. And concerning gender inequalities and the link with taxation, well, not sure that it does really exist because in the informal sector, essentially, you find women. And this informal sector also escapes to the taxation regime. So I don't think that there is a direct link between spatial inequalities and gender inequalities and the taxation system. It's difficult to establish this. The data we have of the survey we carried out at the level of the households maybe could give some information, but I'm not sure that it could confirm this kind of statement. Now, concerning gender inequality and spatial inequalities, as it's been said, the main observation, the main conclusion of this research project is that inequalities are essentially related to the regions in Cameroon. And even within the regions, you can find some differences between less organized regions and better organized, better organized cities or municipalities and the others. So I don't think that there is a correlation between gender inequalities and spatial inequalities and taxation because there is the informal sector, as I said, that is very much present in the country, and also because there is a problem, a very big problem of unemployment. In 2014, we have collected data and we've seen that we've gone from 70% in 2010 to 75% in 2014. So there is a problem of lack of unemployment that is quite important. And the third element that we could also highlight here is related to the poor households affected by inequality. And one of the conclusions of this research, in fact, is that inequalities affect more poor households as compared to households that are not poor. And so it doesn't seem that we can establish a correlation between spatial inequalities and gender inequalities and the taxation system. That's the conclusions. Thank you. Well, thank you very much. Another question, quite different, that I'd like to ask to Mrs. Rivière. Concerning the sector of health, loans have been mentioned, but you have to repay the loans. So do we necessarily have to have a full profit project in order to be able to repay the loans that would be given to sectors such as the health sector? That's a very good question. Well, we have different tools of intervention. We have loans and we have subsidies. And quite clearly, in very poor countries, those poor countries do not have the possibility to pay back the loans, of course. And so we try in some sectors to rather use subsidies. But we should also be aware that the strategy that I explained to you earlier on is also faced with problems of availability of funds and the availability of tools. You can have some loans, you can have subsidies, and the subsidies at the same time cannot grow exponentially. There's a limit to the possibilities for intervention, particularly in the social sector. Well, thank you for your answer. I don't know whether someone else would like to add something concerning this specific point. Mr. Boughzala, we don't hear you. Well, concerning what question? Well, the question that was asked to Mrs. Rivière, i.e., if the projects that focus on the health sectors, whether these are not the sectors that should be funded with aid, because at the same time they are not profit sectors. Well, health projects are social projects for the country, and they are very profitable, but not necessarily at the individual level. It is a profitability that's not going to be translated at the level of the individuals. It's something that's going to be perceived at the level of the country, a better health situation, a quality of life. And this, of course, is going to have an impact on the incomes, on the taxation, on the capability for the country to pay back loans. So it is a principle that's worth everywhere. If you want to develop a country, you have to create productive projects and a sustainable project as well. And so it means projects that are going to generate incomes for the state and for the people. So that is the main principle, I think. Now, in some specific cases, of course, it is possible to use the principle of subsidies, but in fact, a profitable project should be profitable at individual level and or at global level. So I'm not saying that I'm against social aspects, as I said earlier, to trade unionists. It's possible, but at the same time, yes, there is also the aspect of sustainability, indeed. Yes, sustainability is important. Projects should be profitable in the longer term, so not for the short term, but for the long term as well. And they must be compatible, of course, with the natural resources and the environment. So what you're saying, so I'm first going to give the floor to Mr. Tamga, who wanted to add something, and then I'll give the floor again to Mr. Cogneau. Mr. Tamga? Yes, thank you. I was wondering whether we could have a more general reflection to the extent to which funding health represents a cost. So for public policies, maybe it might be interesting. There was an initiative that was launched a few years ago. It was with the objective of obtaining a partial payback. So maybe we should try to focus on the poorest so that they can have a better access to health services that can be put on an equal footing as educational services. We've observed in Cameroon that one of the drivers is education. And as I said, we could think about all this and ask whether we should not create opportunities and create a market so that it is possible for the poor households to have access to a decent work that would allow them to have more easily access to health services. In the years following the initiative for poorest countries, it was an initiative that was trying to alleviate those countries from poverty. And there's always a difference between alleviating and reducing poverty. So this initiative was aiming at increasing the basic services in the field of health and education. But we realized that while this initiative was developed in the countries, unfortunately, poverty decreased, but not to the extent that was expected. We were at 40.5 points in 1987, and we had a slight improvement. But taking into account the amounts invested, we can really wonder whether the reduction of poverty was proportionate to all the investments made. And in the years starting in 2010, we started talking about reducing poverty by the creation of opportunities, by creating a market for the poor. So I think that offering for free health services or education is something that refers to poverty, but we could start working on inequalities. And to do that, you have to create opportunities. You have to create markets. Thank you. Mr. Cogneau, would you like to add something? Yes, maybe very briefly concerning health and the relationship between aid and national funding. I think that health is a sector that is very motivating for development aid because it requires long-term investments on the one hand. So long-term means going beyond the term of governments. And also because, as we've seen with the pandemics, it can have a global impact. And so donors might be interested to see the countries investing in health, for instance, to fight against pandemics. And many development economists have referred to this recently. Now, concerning domestic policies, I think, and I'm going to repeat what I said, I'm a bit obsessed by this. We have health systems that are dualist as well. You have health policies, you have investments in that field that are like a luxury with very nice hospitals. And on the other hand, you have small clinics, you have small health centers in rural areas where you don't have a lot of equipment. So the most privileged categories can use a private health system, maybe sometimes outside of their country, so they can go to other countries, and maybe they are not sufficiently impacted by the kind of health services they can have in their country. Now, concerning paying back the costs, we've demonstrated that whether we talk about health or education, paying back the total costs is very negative for the access to health of the poorest groups. So this policy that was promoted in the liberal times has been abandoned since then by the donors and even in the doctrine of the International Monetary Fund of the World Bank. So paying back costs is really a problem now today, and it's a very important element. It is an attractive element of some political platforms. So we have this concept of universal health coverage. It's part and parcel of many political programs today. So supposedly this universal coverage should progress in many countries, for instance, in Senegal or in the Ivory Coast and elsewhere. And the problem is that this coverage has not really been deployed. And I would like to come back to the topic of taxation. I think it would be good to identify solutions that's not the payback of costs, but rather taxation solutions, innovations in that field that would make it possible to offer to people of the informal sector who do not have access to the health sector, to those services, to pay some taxes, not much, but for those taxes, they would have access to health services, to basic services such as vaccination against the COVID-19. And innovation is that it can be disturbing because there is no direct equivalent between a tax and an advantage. But at the same time, it is the kind of solution that most probably should be further tested in the future if we really want to have this kind of universal health coverage. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. And I guess that Mr. Enda, who told us about the importance of water, the importance of electricity, will fully agree with you to say that health is also very important. But now I would like to move on to another question, and I would like Mr. Enda to answer this question first. Can studies help governments and public development banks? Do you think that's possible? Yes, studies can be used to support governments because studies reveal the reality on the ground. Because in our studies, we use data coming from surveys. So this corresponds to the reality on the ground. And I believe that's a very important laboratory, and that's a document that can be used by decision makers, government representatives, and this can really shed a light on political decisions. And I would like to come back to the previous question you raised about the importance of health. That's very important, and we need to fund the health system. Today, in Côte d'Ivoire, we're not making progress on the issue of universal insurance or coverage. But we believe that this contribution could be paid through some form of tax system that could be recovered through the VAT system, because everyone is contributing to this system. So we could use this tax opportunity in order to make sure that these measures benefit to all. So the question of health is very important. And indeed, these studies could shed light on the decisions made by governments. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Enda. We're reaching the end of this panel discussion, so I'd like to turn to the panelists. Would you like to share other comments or ideas with us before we close this very interesting session? Are there any requests for the floor? Would you like to share anything with us? Mr. Boughzala? Well, I could tell you many things, and that's a problem. I would like to insist on the importance of education. This is an effort that should be made by countries to make sure that education is accessible to all. And children should go to school as soon as possible at the very early age, and maybe even before they're born, because that's very important. Succeeding in school depends on the environment and the family you come from. It has an impact on many different aspects, and this is due to the existence of a transport system, of a canteen. So we should really invest so that children can have access to quality education, this education that will give them opportunities to find a good job. That's essential. Earlier on, I told you about social capital, and we know that's very important, but our measures are not giving very good results. The situation is not perfectly clear, but I believe that the country should be able to generate income using health projects or coming from other projects. Now, there are many, many things to be said, but I do not want to be too long, and I would like to thank you very much for your kind attention. Yes, I can see that there is another request for the floor, Mr. Cogneau, but I believe that you simply agree. Yes, I simply wanted to say that I fully agree with you. Yes, I believe we'll have the opportunity to discuss this together. Yes, that would be our pleasure. Yes, I would like to insist on the inequalities in terms of education in the dualistic system resulting from colonialism. We can see that inequalities in terms of education are very important, even more important than inequalities related to access to land, for example, because of course there are land inequalities, but they're more limited. And the inequalities in terms of education are the most important inequalities in this dualistic system. And if we reduce this dualism, we can really reduce education inequalities. And I'd like to come back to inequalities of opportunities, because indeed, even if you have this equality in education between girls and boys, and Mr. Boughzala said, you still have inequalities between men and women on the labor market, especially when it comes to political positions. And that's because that's why the system is really biased from a gender point of view. Yes, but I believe that the future is really there for women because they're more successful, and I'm sure it will lead to positive results for them. Well, thank you very much. That was a very interesting contribution. I believe we can close on these comments, unless there are other requests for the floor, but I do not have the feeling it is the case, which means that we're going to close our discussion. We're perfectly on time, and I would like to tell you that we're going to share a link on Slido so that you can download all the studies presented. You'll have more detailed information about all of these very interesting projects. And of course, I would like to highlight the fact that without education, we won't be able to move ahead. That's very important. And I would like to thank all of you for joining us this afternoon. I would like to thank you for presenting these projects. Thank you very much to all the members of the panel. Now, should you have any other questions, feel free to get in touch with AFD. And we hope we will meet again in the coming days because we still have many items on the agenda. My name is Suyin Arts. I was very happy to be with you this afternoon, and I would like to thank all of you. See you soon. Thank you.
From AFD, Agence Française de Développement, we want to tell you what the EU AFD Research Facility on Inequalities is, the projects we are carrying out, and our main research findings. The EU AFD Research Facility on Equalities is a programme funded by the European Commission and managed by AFD, aiming to improve knowledge and understanding of economic and social inequalities, their determinants and underlying mechanisms at different spatial levels, as well as the most effective policies and approaches to reduce them. With a budget of €4 million for the period 2017 to 2020 and a steering committee comprised of the European Commission, AFD and AECID, the Spanish cooperation, the programme launched more than 20 research projects in over 20 countries. This facility also aimed to engage in a joint reflection with member states on ways to strengthen the contribution of EU development cooperation to the fight against inequalities, in the framework of the implementation of Agenda 2030, and to contribute to EU development policy whose overarching objective is the eradication of poverty. The objectives of this facility are achieved through a three-pronged strategy. 1. Conducting research on the determinants and dynamics of economic and social inequalities in developing countries. 2. Targeting our work in partner countries that have expressed an interest or need. 3. Support partner countries and development institutions to integrate research findings into national policies and development cooperation strategies. Did you know that the EU AFD Research Facility on Inequality has produced over 100 research papers and policy briefs? All these articles analyse the links between inequalities and a wide array of topics such as education, health, labour markets, housing, taxation and climate change. These research publications, the support to the structuring and the strengthening of research networks on the topic of inequalities, further supports policymakers and development in mainstreaming and tackling the reduction of inequalities in their policies and strategies. However, The main point we would like to share with you is that we have observed how generalized are the effects of inequalities for societies, how unequal access to public services lowers the willingness to pay taxes, how unequal access to stable jobs creates poverty traps and exclusion, and how inequality shapes perceptions and the willingness to cooperate. So, how can we help strategies to reduce inequality? Through the development of new tools such as the inequality diagnostics, and the expansion of existing tools such as the fiscal incidence analysis and the multidimensional inequality framework, the EU AFD Research Facility on Inequalities supported the governments in partner countries and the civil society in building evidence-based strategies to reduce inequality. All these results have been presented at conferences, such as the 2018 International Conference on Inequalities and Social Cohesion, in national workshops and stakeholders events, such as those organised in Bolivia, Mexico, Tunisia and South Africa, in a series of webinars organised in 2020, and of course, in this final conference. In this final conference, beyond the presentation of all the results of the facility, there will be an opportunity to launch a second phase of reflections and partnerships that will be articulated in the extension of the facility over the period 2021 to 2026. We will be supporting 4 countries, Colombia, Indonesia, Mexico and South Africa, to design and implement policies to reduce inequalities. Will you join our goal to reduce these inequalities? Help us share the knowledge on reducing inequalities.